Good afternoon, everyone. The UQ MBA Careers and Professional Development team would like to welcome our MBA students and alumni, also our wider UQ Business School community, attending today's event, Managing Mental Health in Quarantine. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which the University of Queensland now stands and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. Please note that today's session is being recorded. If you have not already submitted questions for Diane, please feel free to ask questions on the Q&A chat box as we get through the session. The last couple of months have been incredibly challenging, with change happening in every facet of life. Many of us are experiencing high levels of fatigue, anxiety and sadness, as well as a lack of motivation, all of which can negatively impact our performance in interpersonal interactions. As we embark on our back to work strategy again, we will be asked to change and find a new normal life after COVID-19. It is now more important than ever to keep our eye on our own mental health and that of our colleagues. Dr. Diane Harner is a published neuroscientist and mental health professional who has spent the last 15 years in the corporate environment. As the founder and managing director of CleverMinds Consulting, Diane combines her business acumen with her expertise in neuroscience to drive individual and organisational performance. Diane has a special interest in creating psychological safety and mental well-being in the workplace. Diane will discuss with us today personal mental health in the aftermath of COVID-19. Thank you, Diane, for joining us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Rox. Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's about this time where I would normally look out into the audience and see a few familiar faces and smiling faces. And what's been really interesting as we've shifted from sort of in-person presentations to online presentations is how much I miss the energy of being in the room with the audience. And so I guess that's what this is all about today. Actually, it's about noticing how we have responded to the current situation, and also understanding why we have thought and behaved in the way that we have. And what we also want to do is equip ourselves with tools to be able to manage what is coming next. So those of you who have heard me speak before know that I always look at things from the perspective of how our brain orchestrates everything that we think, feel, do and say. So lately we've been surrounded by lots of heavy content. So I wanted to start off today with a little bit of a lighthearted reflection about what we've been through with COVID-19. So I think it was about mid-March for me when I thought, wow, something is really becoming unhinged here, when everybody went out and they hoarded toilet paper. And I think for all of us, there was a little bit of denial right at the beginning. And we thought maybe this was going to be like the swine flu or SARS, which didn't really have the impact that COVID-19 has had on us. So being in that denial was one thing, but we quickly transitioned out of that as we realized that this was a really serious situation. But to this day, I really don't understand why collecting toilet paper was a rational response to a respiratory condition. But anyway, that's what happened. So the next phase we got into was really understanding that this was serious. And what we started doing then was we started to consume media in whatever format we could. We watched the news, we looked on social media, we talked about it to our friends and our family and our colleagues. And what this was our brain was trying to understand the threat. Our brain was trying to work out what it needed to do to keep us safe. And then as we sort of moved through the change curve, we started to move out of the office and into a work from home kind of environment. And that's when a lot of our behaviours really, really had to change. And this is when also the relative importance of things shifted. Our priorities kind of shifted during this time as well. And this was probably the most exhausting time because change is incredibly hard. And so what I'm going to talk about in just a moment is how much change we have actually had to go through in order to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think one of the biggest impacts for most of us has been the way that we deliver our work, the way that we interact with our clients and our colleagues. So we all shifted to seemingly endless Zoom sessions. And this has really had a great impact on the way that we collaborate and the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we get work done. And I can honestly say that if I look at this this slide here, I've experienced every single one of those things on Zoom, and I'm sure you all have. And you know, when we end up looking at ourselves for such a long time and so frequently, we can get a little bit exhausted by it all. So I would be, you know, I can totally understand if by this point in time you're a little bit over getting onto Zoom calls. So I don't think I've actually gone through a Zoom call without having this awkward smile at the end, whether I'm the host or one of the people who's participating, because I can never seem to leave the Zoom meeting quick enough when it's finished. So I end up having this weird smile on my face as I search frantically for the button. Okay, so that's where we've been. That's what we've been through. And you know, I know that a lot of us are feeling quite exhausted, quite fatigued, quite run down, and quite frankly, a bit out of situation. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting about what has actually been asked of us. Now, I wanted to talk to you about this through the context of the S-curve, which is what you can see now. So every process, every product, every routine, every relationship has a lifetime. And so you can see at the start of the path where the purple line is, if you start something new, there's kind of a bit of a dip, and then we kind of get good at it anymore, or it's not appropriate, or it's not fit for purpose anymore. Now, just before that happens, or when that happens, what we are asked to do, or what we need to do, is we actually need to jump on a new S-curve. So we need to jump from the purple one and onto the red one. And this jump from one S-curve to the other represents change. Now, if we think about all of the things in our lives, so how we work, how we educate our kids, how we socialize, how we commute, how we entertain, what we can touch and what we can't touch, how we communicate with each other. There's an S-curve representing every single one of those things. And we have been asked to jump on a new S-curve for every single one of those things. And what happens after we jump onto a new S-curve and we engage in that change, there is always a dip. Because actually our brain doesn't like to change things. Our brain loves routine. It would like us to stay exactly the way we are until the end of time because it's cognitively exhausting for our brain to change. So in that time when we engage in change, there is always uncertainty and anxiety associated with that. So this is part of the reason why right now we are all so exhausted. And I just wanted to explain something that you might have heard. It's sort of been going around a little bit on the media. And it's about why we are feeling drained in our body and also drained in our mind. And it's because every time we experience a stress, and change is a stress pretty much every single time, what happens is that our body needs to adjust to that. So what happens is a process called allostasis. And so what happens during allostasis is that when we experience a stress, we release a whole heap of chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol and other chemical messages that allows us to adapt to our new situation. Now, this is part of what keeps us alive, and this is part of what keeps us evolving and adapting to our environment. And if we're only doing that every now and again, it would be fine. But what happens is if we are stressed continuously and persistently, what's called the allostatic load is really high. So what that is the wear and tear on your body and your brain that results from being repeatedly stressed. So what happens is we have a stress, we have all of these chemicals that allow us to adapt to our new situation. But if we do that over and over and over again, that state of adapting becomes damaging to our body and our brain. This is why chronic stress is so bad for us. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a talk about our brain now. So the rest of the talk is really going to be around how our brain has orchestrated the things that we've done over the past few months, particularly with regards to our emotional responses and our stress response and how we've been able to manage that or not. So if you've seen me speak before, this slide will be a little bit familiar, but what I'm going to do is take you just for a bit of a cook's tour around the brain so you can understand how it works. So this back part of the brain is really responsible for all of our survival mechanisms. It, is inherently selfish. It only really cares about us. It's responsible for our heart rate and our breathing, our compulsive behavior, and pretty much it just wants to keep you alive. When you are in survival mode, this part of the brain is the part of the brain that's really active. Now, the next part of the brain is called the feeling brain or the emotional brain, and this is the part of the brain that processes our emotions and has memories of emotions. It's also where our values and our gut feelings sit, and this is also where our habits and our routines sit. It's also responsible for our passion and our drive and motivation. Now, this back part of the brain is the subconscious part of the brain, but this back part of the brain is also where instinctive automatic responses come from. So when we are triggered by a threat in our environment, it's this back part of the brain that responds. Now, the front part of the brain is the part of the brain that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So it's called the prefrontal cortex, and it's responsible for all of our cognitive tasks. So understanding, our planning, analyzing, reasoning. It's also where our working memory sits. But one of the main jobs of our prefrontal cortex is to manage all of the stuff that goes on at the back of the brain. So when we are stressed and we have that emotional response, it's the prefrontal cortex's job to actually manage that so we can still function in this life. We can still get up and go to work rather than, screaming, running around screaming, that the world is going to end. So it allows us to regulate our behavior and the way that we feel. Now, when it comes to our threats, and detecting our threats, there is a specific part of the brain that is really central to this, and it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is like the threat detector in our brain. It is constantly surveying our environment for threat. And when our amygdala detects threat, what it does is it starts the fight, flight, or fright response, which is, preparing our body for action. So as you can imagine right now, there is threat everywhere. There is, threat to our health, there is threat to our finances, there's threat to our families, there's threat to our jobs, there's threat to our way of life. Change in routine can represent a threat, and our amygdala is incredibly sensitive. So it is because our amygdala is absolutely pinging right now that we're experiencing some of the more cognitive symptoms or cognitive challenges. So when we detect threat and our amygdala goes off and the fight, flight, or fright response is started, sends through the hypothalamus, what happens is the chemicals that are released as a part of that fight, flight, or fright response actually decrease the function of our prefrontal cortex. So what that means is all of those beautiful executive functions that allow us to perform, but also allow us to regulate our emotions, goes down. And it's because of that that you might be feeling these kinds of things. You might be feeling a bit fuzzy, like you can't really think clearly. You mightn't be able to concentrate or focus as much. You might be procrastinating. So you mightn't be, pursuing your goals like you normally would. You start putting things off. You mightn't be able to make a decision. You might have all of the information in front of you, but not be able to actually move forward with something. You might have this general feeling of anxiety or uneasiness, and you may have some insomnia. You might be finding it difficult to sleep. And that's because our amygdala, that threat detector, is on. And it is constantly triggering our fight, flight, or fright response, which is decreasing the capacity of our prefrontal cortex, which is what we need to do all of our clever things at work. Now, the thing about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is that there's actually an inverse relationship. So when our amygdala is going off, our prefrontal cortex goes down. However, we actually need our prefrontal cortex. We need our prefrontal cortex in order to regulate our emotions and manage our behavior and maintain positivity and be focused and pursue our goals and actually do all of that analytical and cognitive work that we're asked to do. So we need the prefrontal cortex to come back online so it can perform that function for us. And you'll notice this happening when you're triggered by something, and then just a little while later, like I'm talking seconds, your rational mind starts to kick in and go, okay, let's make a plan. What really is the situation here? So that is when your prefrontal cortex is going, okay, I need to come back online to manage this situation. Now, the important thing to understand about the prefrontal cortex is that the resource that it has is limited and exhaustible. So we can run out. And what that means is that if we are constantly, A, trying to do cognitive work, and B, trying to manage all of the emotions that are happening at the back of our brain because of all the threat that we're in, these things will happen. We feel exhausted. We have a lack of motivation. We have a general lethargy. We just don't feel like doing anything. And we can get burnout. But this is not necessarily a physical fatigue. It is a cognitive fatigue because your prefrontal cortex is working so hard to manage everything that's going on at the back of our brain. So another way to look at it, and this is the good old Yerkes-Dodson curve that I've spoken about previously, is that if we look at stress, some stress is good because it gets us to performance. But if you look, so stress is along the bottom and performance is along the side. Up to a certain level of stress, we get that optimal performance where our prefrontal cortex is on and everything is great and we're doing great work. But if our amygdala keeps firing and we keep getting that stress, the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to perform for us goes down. And that's when we start to see the fatigue and the exhaustion, the poor health and the breakdown and the burnout. Okay, so I think, we can all agree that none of us are really at absolute 100% right now. But what is also really true is that everybody is managing this in their own personal way. So the way that it feels for you, whilst might share some similarities with somebody else, our life situation, our work situation, the way that we feel and the way that we manage stress are all very unique to us. So it's at this time when, we're going to start moving back to the office and start seeing people, that the fact that we are on our own personal journey will really start to be obvious as people manage the situation in different ways. So you might see people who just throw themselves into work and use what we call the top-down approach or a cognitive approach to just distract themselves by consuming themselves with work as a way to manage that emotion. You might see people who are not coping at all and just want to hide away and be very safe and secure. You might also see people express anger and frustration at the situation as well. And I think part of this guy's frustration is that his organisation has not given him a mobile phone. You might see people who are completely overwhelmed and their prefrontal cortex is just not coping at all, so they can't actually move forward with things. And you also might see people who are actually really sad and not coping. So I guess the message that I wanted to get across here is that now is the time for empathy. Now is the time to not judge somebody's situation because we don't know what's going on for them. We can't draw comparisons between how we're coping and somebody else is coping. We need to make allowances that people might be really emotional. They might be really withdrawn. And we kind of have to meet people where they are. Now is also the time for napping. If I had one thing that I could prescribe to everybody to support their mental health right now, it would be sleep. And the great thing about working from home is that you can nap, but only for 20 minutes. If we go longer than 20 minutes, it's actually worse for us in terms of our arousal. So 20 minutes naps are okay. All right, so let's look at our working from home situation now. So what are some of the challenges that we have been experiencing? Because really these are some of the challenges that we will also carry forward. Buffer did a survey called the State of Remote report earlier this year. And what they found was that the top 3 things that people are really challenged by when working remotely are collaboration and communication. It's so much harder. Being socially isolated and feeling lonely and disconnected, and also not being able to unplug. And I think, that third one is really interesting because a lot of organizations were dragging their heels introducing flexibility into the workplace because they were concerned that if they couldn't see their people that they wouldn't be working. And what we're seeing is the exact opposite, that because we don't have that definition between our workday and our home, either by geography or defined by a commute, people are finding it really difficult to draw that line in the sand and say, okay, my workday is finished now and now it's time for family, because our laptop's always there and I could just sneak in, I could just respond to that email, I could just quickly write that little report. So that's one of the challenges that we've been having. With regards to collaboration and communication, there is nothing that will replace the productive and robust conversation and sharing ideas when you've got 2 people in a room together. The lag that is created on video conferencing makes it difficult because people will start talking at the same time. It's like, you go, no, you go, sorry, you speak, and then people just put their hands up in the air and they stop talking. So which reduces the ideation and the creativity in an organization. We also miss out on the passive information transfer of, being able to walk over to somebody's desk or chat to them in the tea room, or just ask a quick question if we don't understand. So we have to actually over communicate when we're in a remote working situation. And of course, we miss that connection of being with people, and sometimes this can make us feel out of the loop. And I think what's going to be really interesting is when we go to more of a blended working style where some people are in the office and some people are at home, this disconnection might feel amplified because the people who are remote might start to wonder what they're missing out on in terms of what's happening in the office. Okay, so let's now start looking at the challenges that we're going to face. Let's call them out in terms of returning to the office. Now, the reality is the risk of this virus is going to remain with us. There's not as a significant load in the community as there was at the beginning, but until we have a vaccination or a treatment, there are going to be measures in place to minimise the possibility of spread. So I think we just have to accept that that's going to be with us for a little while and will have an influence on how we work and how we interact. Good old hot desking, I think, will reduce or cease. Desks will be spaced out, which will also have an impact on communication and collaboration. I think organisations will also start to think about whether they need all the office space that they have as well. And there are other things, just like your normal day-to-day. the sharing of equipment, the increase in intensity in cleaning procedures, and also, just being mindful about, your interactions with people and maintaining social distancing, which, all contributes to that management of change, which can be really, really exhausting. And thirdly, and this is kind of an interesting one, getting in and out of the office is going to be harder. And this is going to be from a commuting perspective, because of course we need to observe social distancing and commuting. And also there's the risk of exposure from, being in an enclosed environment with a number of people. But also, and Rox and I were talking about this earlier, is the use of lifts, because only two people can be in a lift at the same time. Getting up and down a building is going to be really hard. So it's these tiny little changes that we have to adapt to that are actually going to make a difference to us. So let's now look at the psychological challenges of returning. And something that I know is on a lot of people's minds is the risk of exposure. From commuting, sharing equipment, being in larger groups indoors, and this will actually influence whether people want to come back to work or not. And I think, in terms of our leadership, we at this point have to be really empathetic and accepting of each person's requests in terms of coming back to work, and also their individual situation. So they might have somebody at home who is immunocompromised, and so they want to sort of protect them by not going back into the workplace as well. We can get social anxiety around being with people again, and I actually experienced this myself. So I had been doing Zoom sessions with a client, and just a week or so ago I had my first in-person session with her, and I felt anxious. And it's because our brain gets accustomed to the way things are. And so I had been communicating this with this person over Zoom, and then all of a sudden I was in the same room as her, and then I became much more aware of myself and how I was behaving and speaking and acting, but I also became much more aware of her nonverbal communication as well. So just be ready for that one, and just sit with it, because it just does pass. A lot of people have really enjoyed being at home and spending time with family and connecting with family members. And it's been a really special time for some people. So as we return to work, it is absolutely normal to feel some guilt about kind of ending that time. And I think this is something that a lot of people will struggle with. And also, of course, our poor darling pets. My dog's having a sleep right beside me here. And, they're used to having us around now. So if you don't have kids, but you do have a pet, you might actually feel some sadness or guilt about leaving your pet behind as well. And lastly, we are being asked to change again. All of those things where we had to jump onto the new S-curve, we have to jump on another one again. So, and it's not a matter of just reverting to what we did before, because what we did before is no longer appropriate or valid. So this is about finding a new way, taking into consideration our current situation. Okay, so let's now talk about what we do to monitor our mental health. We know the challenges that we've got ahead of us. We know there are going to be some psychological challenges. So never before has it been more important to actually look after ourselves and really enhance that self-awareness we have for how we're going. Having that moment where we check in to see if we're okay, but also importantly, checking in with our colleagues to see if they're okay. Now, what we need to look out for, and as I said before, people will express stress and anxiety and their challenges in many, many different ways. But these are some of the things that come up commonly. So you'll see exhaustion and fatigue. So if somebody is not performing to how they would normally perform, it's not laziness. It might just be that they are worn out from managing all the change. You might see increased emotions, anger, sadness. You might see a lack of patience or a lack of tolerance because, you know, our prefrontal cortex, which is being hammered right now, is responsible for managing all of that. You might have physical symptoms. Now, remember, we talked about the allostatic load and the impact and the wear and tear on that constant responding to threat and how that affects our body. So you might have aches, pains, nausea, loss of appetite, and many other things. You might find that you have unhelpful thoughts, catastrophization happening. You might see a decreased focus, concentration, and motivation towards your work and many other things actually, you know, towards things that you used to enjoy or maybe towards sport because, you know, there's this heaviness that stops you from sort of moving forward and engaging. You might see some antisocial behavior or some withdrawal. People withdraw when they want to feel safe. And, you know, in this threatening environment we have, withdrawal is a really common behavior. People might have difficulty controlling their behavior. If their prefrontal cortex is worn out and has had enough, then those emotions and the behavior that is driven by those emotions might come forward. We might find that we become a little bit negative, that we ruminate on the problems and the drama that's going on. And we also might see a bit of increased absenteeism or disengagement. So these are all, you know, there's lots of different ways that things can be expressed, but these are some of the things that we need to look out for. But what I want to add to that, if I can go to the next slide, here we go, is that some of this is normal. So it's normal to feel sad or tense or angry. But what we need to look out for is when these feelings persist for an extended period of time, or when they become so intense that they start to interfere with the day-to-day functioning, our day-to-day functioning in our lives. So if it becomes persistent or starts to impact our functioning, that is when we need to really start addressing these things. So what we need to notice in ourselves and also in other people is when behavior tends to go towards the extremes, when it's inappropriate for the situation, whether it's too intense or not intense enough, or when people start to do things that are out of character. They should be the big red flags that pop up for us. And if you are concerned, please contact your company's employment assistance provider. This is a counselling service that can help employees. It's completely confidential. If your organisation doesn't have an EAP provider, this would be a great conversation to have right now. Otherwise, speak to your GP or another mental health professional. All right, so two of the biggest emotions that we're managing right now are uncertainty and anxiety. So what I wanted to do is just go through some strategies for managing uncertainty and anxiety because if I'm being honest, our uncertainty and anxiety probably isn't going to go away for a little while because we are navigating such a dynamic environment right now. So the first thing is that we need to just acknowledge how we're feeling, sit with our feelings and know that these feelings will pass. We need to normalize the fact that we're feeling uncertain and anxious. You know what? So is everybody else. You know, breathing through it and not immediately trying to, you know, shove it down or use a maladaptive coping strategy like, you know, alcohol or, you know, another substance is, you know, what we really need to do. We need to sit with it, breathe through it, and allow it to pass. A strategy that is really useful that's used in a lot of therapy is naming an emotion to tame the emotion. So name it to tame it. So even if you just say, I'm feeling really anxious right now, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, I'm feeling really frustrated, the act of naming the emotion will actually help to regulate it because it brings our prefrontal cortex online. All right, the next thing is that we need to be mindful of our media consumption. So this goes with news, our social media, the discussion forums that we get involved in, because there's that critical point where it becomes less about learning and understanding the situation and actually starts to have a damaging effect by increasing our anxiety and our perception of the threat that is in the community. So a great way of managing this also is being really deliberate about having tech-free time every day. Just put your phone away, put the TV away, and go out into nature. Go for a walk, take the dog for a walk, exercise. But it's really, really important. I can't stress this enough. And we're so tied to our phones these days. You need to actually step away in the interests of your mental health. Exercise is a brilliant way of looking after your mental health. So we get endorphins. It also is a great distraction from the cognitive processes, that maybe if we're ruminating or having some unhelpful thinking, if we start to exercise, we then start to focus on something else. It also decreases the stress hormones that accumulate in our bloodstream as a result of, being triggered by threats. Now, this doesn't have to be, going to a gym or anything like that. It can be incidental exercise. So walking to the shops instead of driving, and, walking up the stairs at work instead of using the lift. So just find different ways where you can sort of elevate your heart rate every day to get those good chemicals happening and decrease the stress chemicals. Aiming for about 20 minutes a day if you can. All right, and the next thing is about control. So uncertainty and anxiety is very much associated with the brain not being able to predict what's going to happen next. And we can't, can we? We can have our best guess, but right now things are changing so quickly that we really don't have a lot of predictive ability about what's going to happen next. So in order to manage that for our brain, what we do is we control the things that we can. So this is where establishing routines is going to be really helpful for you as well. So, we talk about creating a new normal. We need to start to create our routines and our habits in our new normal as well. And if we can start engaging with them and sticking to a schedule, our brain will feel like it's got more ability to predict what's coming next. The other thing is to focus on the positive action we can take rather than feeling sort of helpless. Focus on the activity that you can do to help your situation. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you can see what's called the personal power grid. And I really love this because it talks about the things that you can control versus the things that you can't control and what you do about those things. So if you take action, positive actions about the things that you can control, this is when you feel empowered. This is when you feel like you have real influence over things and you feel safe and secure. If you start taking action and worrying about the things that you can't control, this is when our striving is fruitless and we become anxious, frustrated, and angry. Now, if we don't take action, about the things that we can control, that's when we start to feel helpless. That's when we sort of give up and kind of feel like there's nothing that we can do to influence the situation. So we need to shift that from not taking action to taking action about the things that we can control. Now, regarding the things that we can't control, this is where we need to shift into not worrying about it, not taking action. So when we understand that there are things that we cannot control, and you know what, somebody else's behavior is one of those things, and we decide just to sit with that and accept it for what it is, that's when we can let go. And there is a tremendous amount of relief in kind of recognizing the things that we can't control and just letting go of trying to control them. All right, now what can we do to protect our mental wellness? What are the proactive strategies that we can do to look after ourselves and most importantly look after that prefrontal cortex, which is really responsible for how we're keeping it all together right now? Now, I love this acronym, HALT, and it's actually used in addiction programs because managing addictions is all about regulating emotions and managing thinking and behavior. So what they say is that when you're trying to do that, you've got to support your prefrontal cortex as much as you can because that's what's responsible for doing those things. So they say you should never allow yourself to get too hungry, too angry, too lonely, or too tired. So the next time you're sort of feeling out of control, I want you to stop and I want you to ask yourself those things. When was the last time I ate? What is ticking me off right now? What is making me really emotional? Should I waste my time about it? What positive action can I do to address it and make the situation better? Do I need to reach out to people? How long is it since I connected socially, since I've spent some time with my friends or some colleagues? And the last is, am I sleeping well? What can I do to actually improve my sleep hygiene or the number of hours that I'm getting? Now, if we address those four things, that will give our prefrontal cortex the best chance of regulating the behavior that's coming up as a result of what we're going through right now. And just to finish off, because I think we are at time, I just wanted to give you just a couple more tips around mental wellness. Now, the first thing that I want to say is that we need to speak up. We need to realize that we're not alone in this, and that everybody is also going through the similar experience, maybe not in the same way as you, but we're all in this. So you coming forward and saying that you're having some challenges is not going to be unexpected. So reach out to mentors, reach out to colleagues, family and friends, mental health professionals, GPs. Use the resources that you have available to you. And within your organisations, please start the conversation about what mental health supports are in place, whether there is an EAP within your organisation, and if there is not, I would suggest that would be a good place to start. And the next thing is self-care. We need to be really, really gentle with ourselves right now. So some of the things that we can do to support ourselves are to be realistic about what's possible. We are under an immense amount of stress right now. We're being asked to change and shift and move and to consider a whole heap of things that we didn't have to consider before. So we may not be able to achieve all that we could do before. We may not be able to, show up as well as we could before. And we need to be okay with that and be okay that everybody else is in the same boat. Practicing relaxation techniques like stretching, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness, all of those things that you always hear about in terms of stress management are all really useful, because what that does is it just shushes down our physiology. So our autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for all of that, get up and go, we need to quieten that down and bring online our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system. So these relaxation techniques achieves that. Do things that bring you joy. Be indulgent. If you want to eat chocolate, eat chocolate. If you need to go and have a sleep, go and have a sleep. But be unapologetic about the fact that right now you need to take care of yourself to get through this. Give yourself a break. So take time to just be yourself without any expectations or obligations from anyone else. And the important thing that I want to say here is that you need to take brain breaks at work. And what I mean by that is, like, every hour or so, just take 5 minutes just to power down. And what that does is it refreshes the resource that's available to your prefrontal cortex, so you can do the cognitive work and you can manage the emotions that are coming up as you make your way through the day. And give yourself a nudge. Sometimes, we're feeling a bit lethargic and unmotivated and we don't feel like doing things. But what we do know is that movement creates energy. So if you've got it in you, just to give yourself a little bit of nudge when you don't feel like doing something, what you'll find is that momentum will build. And the last thing is to maintain your interests and connections. These are the things that fill up our cup. When we are being drained constantly by, trying to navigate the world and also try to do our best at work, we need something to fill our cup at the end of the day. Okay, so that is my messages around why we're feeling the way we are right now, what is going on inside our brain, and what we need to do to look after our brain and also our mental wellness as we navigate the next chapter of this crazy world we're living in right now. Okay, so I think at this point we will take some questions, Rox. Is that right?
So thank you, Diane. As usual, insightful and thought-provoking, and I can relate to several of your slides. So thank you. Definitely have that hungry on occasions. So I was just going to start the Q&A with some questions that actually have come through from people that have registered for the session today. So, and then I'll go to sessions that questions that may pop up on the screen, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
There's a question here around how does online communication differ from face to face from a neurochemical perspective?
Oh, what a great question. Excellent. So, I have actually been doing a lot of work recently around trust. And what has come up in that is the role of oxytocin. So, oxytocin is the neurochemical that is responsible for our social connection, our bonding. It's also what allows us to trust people. It is also what allows us to be empathetic and generous with other people as well. Now, we know that oxytocin is upregulated and its release is increased when we come together, when we are in a face-to-face situation, and particularly when we touch. So even the simple act of shaking someone's hand can increase our oxytocin levels. And so oxytocin makes us feel great. It makes us feel connected. And, you know, we establish rapport with people. Now, Paul Zak, who is a neuroeconomist, has done an enormous amount of work on oxytocin and its role in connection and trust and how we are at work. And what he found was that when we do things online, when we do things on video, it's only 80% as effective as increasing our oxytocin as being in person with somebody. So we definitely see a reduction in the production and release of oxytocin when we are online versus face to face. Now, that's not to say that we can't create relationships online, and we often do, and we can feel connected to people. But what the trick is here is that it's largely related to eye contact. So we establish emotional connection through eye contact. And what you'll notice is that it's really difficult to have eye contact on a video conference, because right now I'm looking directly at the camera. So I'm not looking at you, Rox. But if I look up here so I can have eye contact with you, I'm no longer looking at the camera, so you can't look into my eyes. So it's a bit of a challenge. So the answer to that question is face-to-face is so much better for our connection and trust. And the reason is because we have much more oxytocin, which is the neurochemical that's responsible for our social bonding.
Thank you. And I am conscious of time, so I understand some people may have to leave, but we will just go through a couple of more questions, if that's okay, and then we'll wrap up the session, because there are some more questions here. How to avoid procrastination when overwhelmed with work and emotions?
Yes. So procrastination is what happens when, you know, that back of the brain is being really chatty and is telling us all these messages, and the front part of our brain is kind of a bit tired and is it can't override the emotions that are coming from the back of the brain that is probably saying at that point when we're overwhelmed and anxious, let's just do something easy, let's do something safe, let's withdraw and retreat and make ourselves happy. And of course that is not conducive to doing goal-directed work, is it? So the way to get around this is any project that we have to do, what can help is to break it down into tiny, ridiculously small little pieces that don't feel overwhelming to achieve. So that's number one. Number two is to make your tasks more fun. So if that's including somebody else in it, having a change of scenery. So, I think libraries are open now. So going to a library or going to a park and doing the task there. So it's about, you know, increasing the reward around that task that can help you to engage with it. And also giving yourself a little reward for completing a task can help as well. Now, there's one technique that is really useful for procrastination. It's called the Pomodoro technique. And so what you do is you literally set a timer for an amount of minutes, and it could be 5 minutes if you're really struggling, or it could be 30 minutes. And what you say is, right, until that buzzer goes off, I am going to do this work. And then when that buzzer goes off, you have permission to stop. But you know what happens? Once you're in the zone, you tend to keep going. It's actually that activation energy, the amount of energy that takes to get engaged in a task, that is sometimes the hardest to get over.
Great, thanks. And how do we thrive during constant change?
Yeah, this is really a hard one because change is absolutely exhausting, isn't it? So I think one of the main ones is that we actually need to reframe what change means. So we can get a little bit preoccupied with the negative aspects of change, like how this will disrupt our routine, how, we need to really focus on new behaviors and repeating new behaviors so they become habits. So it is exhausting. So if we kind of shift our mindset about change and then really deliberately start thinking about how can this change actually be great for me? What are the positive things that can come out of me engaging in this new behavior or a new way of doing things? So I think that's number one. But the second thing is, in order to manage change, we need to look after the prefrontal cortex that is responsible for directing our change in behavior and for overriding our habits and routines and the way that we've always done things. So this is where self-care really comes into play, diet, sleep, exercise, making sure you look after that prefrontal cortex.
I am conscious of time, so I will only ask one more question that's been submitted. However, I will just let everyone know on the webinar that Diane has said that she will respond to some of the other questions that have come through. So there's just a couple more questions, so we just don't have time to go to those, but Diane will shoot you an email. So the last question for the today is, what will the new normal look like in mental health and in terms of what key factors will leaders need to consider to assist their teams to adapt to the new normal?
Yeah, great question. So what has been a really positive thing to come out of this is that we are having the conversation about mental health at work. So it has become part of what we are considering as important. So now what I think we need to do is to kind of ride the wave and start making sure that we implement policy and support services for people at work around supporting their mental health, and really working hard to remove the stigma around asking for help and really just bringing it into the common language that we use at work. I think the role of EAP services is going to really go up. And as I said before, if you don't have an EAP, now is the time to be having that conversation while everything is very out in the open and current. I think in terms of leadership, there's going to need to be a massive shift to be more empathetic and to consider that each individual right now is having their own experience and has a whole heap of different challenges to manage as well. Like when we used to go to the office between 9 and 5, we dealt with the challenges there and we showed up to work. But when we are going to be mainly part remote and part in the office, all of the things that happen outside of work then become influences in our workday as well. So, leaders having empathy towards people and giving the opportunity to have those very frank, open, transparent conversations about what people are going through and how leaders can support them is going to be critical going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. Again, always, you're a wealth of knowledge, and we really do appreciate you sharing that with us. One of our people on the line has said, thank you so much. So thank you.
It's absolute pleasure.
Yes, so I just wanted to really finish off with just a couple of things in regards to if today's session piqued an interest for you in regards to education. We encourage you to look at our postgraduate programs and executive education, professional development short courses. Our programs are designed to challenge and help you develop the leadership skills, insight and confidence to innovate, adapt and face emerging business challenges head on. So please see the screen there, and if they are of interest to you, please make contact. Also a reminder that MBA applications for our MBA, which we're ranked #1 in The Economist for 2019 international rankings, close on the 30th of June, so not far now. And applications for our full online Masters of Leadership in Service Innovation program, which is presented in partnership with edX, close on the 31st of July. Thanks again for joining us today, and I ask you all to stay online for a minute to complete a quick feedback poll, and please take care, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. Thank you.